I want to go back in time today, almost 500 years, to October 31st, 1517, Germany. And a Catholic priest, at the time somebody who wasn't really of much renown or repute, was writing a letter to his boss. And this particular priest was of the St. Augustine order, and he had been posted to the local university. And it was more of an academic. And the letter that he was writing to his boss was in many ways an academic analysis of many of the current practices of the church, and things that to that priest didn't really make sense. He felt that a lot of the church's practices and the way that they administered themselves and their finances and so forth didn't necessarily follow the teachings and the beliefs of the church. And he felt like that there was some discord there, that there were some inconsistencies, and he felt like it was important to actually raise some of those inconsistencies. And so he wrote a letter to his boss. His boss was a bishop named Albert of Mainz. And when he finished the letter, because he was posted at the university, he also did what was customary at the university. And he took this letter, he wrote a copy of it, and he posted a copy of the letter and nailed it to the door of the All Saints Church in the town where he was posted. It was called Wittenberg, Germany. And that particular priest's name was Martin Luther. And he became one of the most influential figures probably in all of human history. If you look at everything, all the dominance and impact that religion has had in the course of human history, Martin Luther played an extraordinarily significant role. Because what he was doing in his letter was really protesting. Again, it wasn't really, he didn't intend to start a revolution. He didn't intend to stick his finger in the church's eye or anything like that. Really what he was doing was saying, look, these are inconsistent practices. And the primary practice that Martin Luther found to be so inconsistent was the selling of indulgences, essentially priests and the Pope himself going around and for pay, essentially forgiving man's sins for money. And this is something that Martin Luther found inconsistent with the teachings of the church. And he would say, well, look, this is what we tell people, this is what we say, this is what's in the Bible, and so forth. And yet this is what we do. And I find, as an academic, I find this inconsistent. Well, it turned out that there was a tremendous appetite for what Martin Luther had to say. And of course, the world moved a little bit more slowly back then. But within a couple of weeks, copies of his paper had circulated all over Germany. And within a couple of months, it circulated all over Europe. And of course, today, we see revolutions on television. We see Ukraine and Hong Kong and Tunisia and everything that happened in the Middle East. When we see protests and there's no shortage of reporters who go out and talk about the impact of Twitter and Facebook and these sort of social technologies is what they have today. Back then, the big social technology that was brand new was the printing press. And so people got a hold of this letter, and they had a printing press available to them. And so they were able to manufacture copies, and these copies made their way all across Europe, and people could actually see what eventually became known as the 95 Theses. And, the 95 Theses, if you've actually ever read them, they're actually very readable. Martin Luther makes a very strong case. And he says, basically, look, this just doesn't make sense. The Pope is one of the wealthiest people in the world. And at the time, they had just actually broken ground on St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican. And there were a lot of priests who were going around, Dominican friars in particular, who were being sent by as papal commissioners to go and essentially market for the sale of indulgences. So they go around, and in many cases, people that knew they were going to violate the rules would actually prepay. They would prepay to sort of forgive their sins in advance, and there was sort of no more penance and forgive. And this is one of the things that Martin Luther said, look, this is really inconsistent. If you can just pay, there's not really any remorse. And if there's no remorse, then, how can we really say that somebody can be forgiven if there's no remorse and they're just paying? It just doesn't make any sense. It is not scholastically, academically consistent with what we teach. And to him, it didn't make sense because he said, you know what? The Pope is already extraordinarily wealthy. If he wants to build this huge basilica, let him do it with his own money. Instead of going around and sort of extorting the poor and getting people to pay up, and going around to, his rich friends and getting them to pay up so they can continue to commit crimes and so forth. It just doesn't make any sense. Let him do it with his own money. And at first, the church kept pretty quiet about it, and they kind of dismissed it. But it became pretty clear that this wasn't going away anytime soon. And it took a few years. Again, things sort of moved a little bit more slowly back then. But the Pope replied in a paper that became known as Exsurge Domine. And it took him until the 15th of June, 1520. So again, we're talking, basically 2.5 years after Martin Luther makes this, what was essentially almost a scholastic study that just happened to leak out into the public. And the Pope replies. And you would imagine the reply would be something along the lines of, yes, we do sell indulgences, and, we're looking into it. We're going to have a commission and study if this is consistent with our practices. Or really just even say, yeah, we were wrong. We shouldn't have been doing that, and we're going to stop. Something, at least, acknowledge it in some capacity whatsoever. But no, instead, what the church says was, we condemn, reprobate, and reject completely each of these theses. Again, that's called the 95 Theses. Each of these theses or errors as either heretical, scandalous, false, offensive to pious ears, or seductive of simple minds, and against the Catholic Church. And by listing them, we decree and declare that all the faithful of both sexes must regard them as condemned, reprobated, and rejected. And then they go on to sort of threaten anybody who even brings up one of these theses under the penalty of automatic major excommunication. So if anybody even brings up one of these issues, about the sale of indulgences, or why is the Pope going around extorting people to build his new basilica in the Vatican, if anybody even brings it up, then you'll be kicked out of the church and condemned to fire and damnation for until the end of time. Now, that's a pretty strong statement. I mean, you think about it, actually extraordinarily arrogant. And I thought about this time and time again, because the repercussions are pretty severe. It was the exact opposite of really the way, looking back, they should have reacted, because all it did was insane. All it did was really, it just dumped a huge gas truck of fuel on the fire. Because people are already fed up. They're really fed up. Europe in this time was a really interesting thing, because you remember the major power center in Europe for the longest time was the Roman Empire. When the Western Roman Empire fell, say 476, 480 AD, there was a huge power vacuum, and there really had been for, at least a century prior. I mean, the seat really of the Roman Empire had moved to Constantinople. There's really quite a power vacuum across Europe, and the church stepped in to fill that, to tell people how you should live your lives and so forth. I mean, taking in, essentially collecting taxes and going out and waging wars and so forth. I mean, a really major power center that grew and grew and grew in time. And of course, by the 1500s, was a diplomatic and political and financial force to be reckoned with at least across the continent, if not across the world. And at this time, people were really sick and tired of it. And there were a lot of things going on behind the back. And remember, this was a time when the feudal system was the predominant social contract. This is the way that society across Europe organized itself. And remember, one of the key lessons from history is that this way that society organized itself is constantly changing. All these things constantly change. The way that society organizes itself, the financial system constantly changes. The dominant superpower constantly changes. And this was at a time when the prevailing sort of way that society organized itself, the feudal system, was seeing significant strain. There had been dozens and dozens of peasant rebellions. People had just got fed up with it and said, I'm tired of living in filth and squalor and wallowing in the mud and so forth. So that a couple of guys had just, by some complete accident of birth, just happened to be born into nobility, and I have to spend my entire life kicking up to pay off their debts and finance their lavish lifestyles. I'm not going to do it anymore. And there's a lot of strain in that system. The dominant superpower was really the Catholic Church. And there was a lot of strain in the Catholic Church. People in this time, were exceedingly pious, of course, and the church had a very interesting hold on this because, of course, all the religious texts and doctrines and so forth were all in Latin, and the Catholic religion, the Mass and so forth, everything was in Latin. Now, of course, the vast majority of people who were serfs and so forth, nobody could speak Latin. So in many cases, the church sort of could hold it up and say, listen, we have the book of secrets. We know all the secrets of life. We know everything that's going to happen from here to eternity and in the afterlife and so forth. But you can't read it for yourself. You just have to believe us that we know what's going to happen, and you can't read it for yourself. So you just have to trust us. And in a way, we're sort of the intermediary in your relationship with God and the universe and so forth. And in a way, this was a sort of highly centralized, centrally planned theology. And that too, again, as the glue which held together the fabric of the dominant superpower and its constituents, that was also under tremendous strain. Because by 1517, people no longer wanted that intermediary. People no longer wanted an intermediate step between themselves and their relationship with God and the universe and so forth. They didn't want that anymore. They wanted it for themselves. And what Martin Luther was essentially doing was opening up this huge can of worms that he didn't really intend to do. That it continued to stoke these peasant rebellions, rejecting this ridiculous social contract, this ridiculous way that societies organize themselves. I mean, the feudal system was one of the dumbest inventions in all of human history. To say that there should be this handful of people at the top that gets to rule everything by accident of birth, and everybody else, you'll never have any upward mobility ever in your entire life, so long as you both shall live. Really terrible system when you think about it. People were sick and tired of it. They were sick and tired of having the church tell them everything and keeping all the secrets from themselves and just saying, trust me, trust me, trust me. We're going to tell you everything that you need to know about the universe. And, in the meantime, going around and extorting all the poor people and saying, well, hey, you need to pay me money for your sins. People were tired of it. They were tired of it. And what Martin Luther really did was he opened up this can of worms, and it created a revolution. And it wasn't a revolution against the church. It wasn't a revolution against religion. It wasn't a revolution against any of those things. What it was really was a revolution against centralization. It was a revolution against this centrally planned intermediate steps between people in their theological beliefs. And it's really an important point. The history of this is really incredible. I mean, Martin Luther, he went into hiding for a long time. Of course, he was excommunicated. It really fanned the flames of continual peasant uprisings. I mean, these things go hand in hand because essentially what were, this revolution, these waves of rebellion, what became known as the Reformation, and the Counter-Reformation and so forth, these became, really symbols of human beings in their struggle for greater individuality, for greater individual power, no longer wanting to give up power to some central authority, but wanting to take the power back for themselves, to have individual power, to let the individual rule. That's essentially what these events were really all about, and they go hand in hand. The political system and the religious teachings, they wanted more individual control, less centralized control. And it was kind of interesting. There's so many of this. I think about this a lot. I was thinking about this a lot when the whole Edward Snowden thing kicked off, really. And I can't help but find, the similarities in the same way. I don't think that Edward Snowden was necessarily looking to start some major movement or anything like that, but more or less just say, listen, the United States Constitution says this, and the United States government does this, and I find these practices to be inconsistent, and I want people to know about it. Very similar to what Martin Luther was doing. And what happened? Martin Luther was excommunicated. Edward Snowden was effectively excommunicated, and you've got Joe Biden go, come, be a man, come back to the U.S. so we can, throw you in the gulag. Be a man. That's apparently what being a man, in the eyes of Joe Biden means is, facing, certain persecution, for telling the truth. And just a lot of really interesting things. And of course, the U.S. government response was extraordinarily arrogant, just like the Pope and his, Exsurge Domine. The U.S. government response was so arrogant to say, we reject this and we're going to throw, it's completely unapologetic. The arrogance, no apologies whatsoever, and it's really, you have to look at this and say, obviously, there's always so many similarities when we go back and look at our own history, and we see there's really tremendous amount of similarities. But what I really want to key in on today is this idea about, the individual versus centralization, central planning, central authority, central power versus the individual power. And look, at the end of the day, I understand that, central authorities and so forth. I'm not even going to sit here and tell you that about, these, people are evil or so forth. I'm sure everybody has really good intentions. Of course, I found out recently, I told you in our last podcast, which has been a month now, that I found out that, Mr. Barack Hussein Obama is actually a distant cousin of mine. Again, I'm Cousin Barry gave his State of the Union address last night, and there's a lot of policies, of course, we could gripe about. There's a lot of things that any politician can do. We say, oh, they're complete idiots, and look, I'm sure they're all very nice people, and I've never met the man. I've never. I've never met the man, and I can't really say what anybody's intentions are. All I can do is sort of presume that, maybe these guys are really well-intentioned. And maybe, the idea of these things that people propose, yeah, sure, they're all really nice. The idea of helping the poor, yeah, of course, that's a nice idea. The idea of helping the middle class, have more opportunity and all that, yeah, sure, great. Those are nice ideas, and those are really great intentions, and all these things that, whichever political party, Labor, Conservative, Republican, Democrat, they're all very nice ideas. At our event in Chile, that we had down here back in 2013. I remember Nigel Farage, the MEP, very, very great speaker, great guy, said something in one of his speeches at the event here. He told the crowd, he said, communism was a great idea. And I was asking him about it later. We were having drinks, and I said, did you really say communism was a great idea? And he said, yeah, when you think about the intention, what they were trying to accomplish, essentially making sure that there's no poor people in the world. Of course, that's a nice idea. I'm sure everybody might think sure, it'd be great if there was no more war and there was no more homelessness and there are no more hungry children and so forth. And all these things are really great ideas. They're very nice intentions and so forth. But of course, we have to live in reality. And the reality is that we have, a centrally planned system. And my point with today's podcast is to really kind of demonstrate that doesn't really work. And at the end of the day, it's human nature to fight back and want to rise up and take the power back for the individual. That is in our nature, is for individuals to be free. Human beings are born free. And then that's not some grand, philosophical, that's just a statement of fact. Nobody's born on this earth with any obligations to anything or anyone else, period. Full stop. No animal is born with it. No plant is born with any obligations. Human beings are born free. We are all born free. And so it is in our nature, to realize within us that individual power. Being subject to the state or some central authority, that's a learned response. We learn that. We learn that through, our constant social interaction, but deep down inside of us, our instincts are telling us that it is the individual authority that matters most. And if you look throughout history, centrally planned anything just doesn't really work. And human beings have an inner yearning to fight against that. Martin Luther is a great example, because what he really started was this yearning to fight against this centralized authority where people no longer wanted to have an intermediate step in their relationship with their religious beliefs. And I think we can look at the same thing really in any monetary system. And it's kind of interesting that, of course, we spend a lot of time talking about paper currency, versus real assets. And of course, how much purchasing power the dollar's lost ever since they eliminated its connection with gold. But I'm here to tell you, in human history, even systems, of course, gold has been a traditional form of money for hundreds, thousands of years, really, before this modern, paper currency experiment. But the dirty little secret is that even when gold was money, there were significant problems. And the reason for that is because there was always a central authority behind it. In medieval Europe, and you can look back where there are numerous gold and bimetallic monetary standards, where nations had they had gold coinage and they had silver coinage, and of course they would centralize that. They'd have a central mint, and they would the king or whomever would sort of decree whatever the gold silver ratio would be. So, for example, in France, in a single century, there were more than 150 changes to the gold and silver ratio. In 1303, the ratio was 10.26 ounces of silver per ounce of gold. 2 years later, it was 15.9. So from 1303 to 1305, it went from 10.26 to 15.9. A couple years later, 14.46, then 15.64, then 19.55, then 14.37, and so forth. This was all in a 10-year period. Huge roller coaster moves, up and down, up and down. And of course, an interesting thing happens. If you're getting, let's say, if it costs you 15 ounces of silver to buy an ounce of gold in Paris, and in London, it only costs 10 ounces of silver to buy an ounce of gold, then what happens? Well, of course, everybody goes to London with silver. They buy an ounce of gold with 10 ounces of silver. They go to France. They take that ounce of gold. They get 15 ounces of silver. Then they go back to London. They do it all over again. Of course, and they keep making, more and more and more money, right? So what happens? It means essentially all the gold leaves England and all the silver leaves France, because everybody's trying to make a profit. So what happens? This is obviously what happened between England and France, between France and Italy. Everybody's going to Venice, or they're going to London, or they're going to Paris. Everybody's trading gold and silver. So what happens? They establish capital controls, right? In 1294, it's kind of interesting, the scarcity of silver coinage. I'm reading actually from a book. This is actually called the History of Currency from 1252 to 1896. In 1294, the scarcity of silver coinage was so great that a proclamation was put forth ordering silver to be brought to the mint. So what is this? This is confiscation, right? Ordering silver to be brought to the mint and forbidding the export of metals. So what do we have? We have confiscation and we have capital controls. In consequence of the futility of this ordinance, a further proclamation was issued in 1309, this is 15 years later, forbidding the circulation in France of English silver sterlings and gold florins of Florence, and crying down the exchange denomination of all other foreign coins. So again, we see confiscation, we see capital controls, we see exchange controls. This is the sort of stuff that happens. Why? Look, they had gold and silver as their currency, and you think, of kind of free market types. We think, great, that's fantastic, gold and silver is money. But there was a problem, and the problem wasn't even about paper, and it wasn't even about what type of currency. The problem really came down to what? It was an issue that it was all centrally planned. That you had one guy, in this case, the king or whomever, saying, today, the gold and silver ratio is this. 2 years later, it's going to be this. 1 year later, it's going to be this. 6 months later, it's going to be this. Who the hell is he? Who is this guy that just gets to wake up one day and go, oh, well, this is what I'm going to do? It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. If you imagine, the nuclear control room, where you've got all these, extraordinarily dangerous reactors and all these, moving parts and so forth. If you imagine, the world's biggest nuclear reactor in some control room where there's a million buttons and gears and dials and levers, and you got one guy in there, pushing the buttons and turning the gears and the dials and then pulling all the levers and so forth. You leave one guy in charge of a million different things, trying to control a million different, moving pieces and big machines and so forth, that just one single failure has catastrophic consequences. That's really what we're talking about. Because when you put one guy in charge of sort of centralizing the money system, in any system, money is essentially the lifeblood of any economy. And so you're really putting one guy in charge of the economy. Of course, the economy has millions and millions of gears and dials and switches. And you put one person in charge of that, or even a couple of people in charge, a committee, right? In charge of that. You're just begging for failure. You're begging for something to go wrong. And that's ultimately the danger of centralization. When you put, a couple of people in charge and you award people this power to do these things and sort of make decisions in their sole discretion, these are the problems that we end up with. And it's human beings, it's in our nature to fight against that. It's not natural to have one guy in charge of millions or billions of levers and gears and moving parts and so forth, and just expect them to not screw it up. I mean, when you think about it, it's utterly ridiculous. And who is this guy who gets to wake up and say, today the gold-silver ratio is 19.55? Yes, I know that's 20%, different than it was yesterday, but that's what I've decided today. And that's essentially what happened. In 1311, the king woke up and said, today it's 1955. And you don't like it? Tough. And who is he? But at the same time, who is Janet Yellen? Who is Mario Draghi? Who are any of these people that get to just wake up and decide today we're going to, print X, billions of dollars and euros. And tomorrow we're not. Tomorrow we're going to curtail. Next month we're going to do this. We're going to set interest rates at that. I mean, and what possible sense does that make? Because what you're essentially doing is asking a handful of people and giving them control and saying, hey, we're going to give you control of billions of levers and moving parts and so forth, and just expect that you're going to get it right. It's utterly absurd. And it is in our nature to fight against that because deep down in our instinct, it doesn't make sense. And our subordination to this system is learned. It is learned through a lifetime of this constant reinforcement, a state-sponsored educational system and so forth. We're constantly reinforced because we see everybody around us subordinate and subjugate ourselves to this system. So, hey, why not? Well, I might as well do it too. And anybody that strays is sort of branded as some, lunatic in the literal sense of the word. And so I want to sort of tie this in. I hate really delving too much into, politics and politicians and so forth, but I want to talk a little bit about this with respect to the State of the Union speech last night that Cousin Barry gave. Cousin Barry is an excellent speaker. I know there was a Republican response and so forth. And look, like I said, all these things, they're all very nice ideas. Many of them start from failed premises. The premise, I remember, I think I wrote about this a while back. I mean, one of the things, of course, you hear presidents say this a lot. They say, as president, my primary responsibility is to protect the American people. Actually, no, it's not. It's not at all. There's absolutely no legal basis for that whatsoever to say that the president of the United States' top responsibility is to protect the American people, as if we're all helpless little children who can't get on. Now, again, nice idea. I'm sure he's a nice guy, and I'm sure he's not saying that, because he's trying to do something evil or nefarious. I'm sure he really feels like he has this great responsibility to take care of people. But that's, there's nothing at all in the Constitution that says that he's supposed to do that. There's nothing at all in his oath of office where he states that he solemnly swears to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and that he will bear true faith and allegiance to the same. There's nothing in there. It says, and I will, wage any war I need to wage in order to protect the American people. There's no clause in there about that. So again, this is a failed premise. And if you really kind of look at it, there's a lot of those out there. For example, one of the things he was saying in his speech, he said something about, in the 20th century, America was tremendously prosperous, and the reason for that is because we had this great education system, and we had all these different things. And you look at it and go, that's actually a failed premise. Again, it's a failed premise. If you go back and you look at sort of why the United States was so prosperous and became, the dominant superpower and so forth in the 20th century is really because, the United States became the largest economy in the world in the 19th century. The United States became the largest economy in the world during the administration of Ulysses S. Grant. And remained that way because Britain was on the way out. And like we said, these key lessons from history is that the dominant superpower is always changing. The social contract, the way societies organize themselves is always changing. The monetary system is always changing. And so the world is always going to look to the next biggest, greatest thing. And back then, that was the United States. And of course, it didn't hurt U.S. chances that the entire, the dominant, the competing dominant powers, Russia, France, England, Germany, and so forth, were completely devastated by 2 world wars. And that the only country left after World War II that had any, manufacturing capacity, any savings and so forth was the United States. So of course, they're going to end up, being the dominant superpower in the world. To sort of claim that it was, that the U.S. became so prosperous because the federal government took over the education system. That's just a failed premise. And I don't think it means that he's a bad guy. I'm sure he's a nice guy. Again, very well intentioned and so forth. But it's just a failed premise. And when you sort of base all these policy decisions, so forth, based on failed premises, then bad things tend to happen, especially when we're talking about these sort of centrally planned powers. You centralize all this power, you put it in the hands of a couple of people and expect them to do, to be successful when they're dealing with millions, hundreds of millions of moving parts. That in and of itself is a failed premise. It's a failed premise to expect success while you hand the keys of the castle to 320 million moving parts and just expect somebody to get it right. That's a failed premise. It doesn't work. And so you look at some of these points, and again, so now we want to now there's we want to have free education at the community college level. Why not? Why not? Why stop at 2 years? Why not give everybody free? Why not make it free? I'll give everybody PhDs. Everybody should have a PhD. Why not? If 2 years of higher education is good, then why not 10? Let's all go to medical school for free. Why not? And who cares about affording it, and who cares about any of that stuff? And I want to actually talk about that in the tax policy. But one thing I'll say is that I can't stand watching stuff. I don't watch it. I can't watch it. I mean, there's the applause and it reminds me. It just reminds me of some propaganda film. I just can't handle it. There's very little truth involved in any of it. But I read the transcripts, and it's a lot faster and less aggravating. And reading about the thing that really caught me, was one is sort of all this talk about sort of fixing the inequality and so forth. And again, that's great. Beef up the middle class. Great idea. Very well intentioned. It's a nice idea, and I'm sure everybody can appreciate that. But I thought it was really kind of a sad reflection of the time that we live in. This whole idea about we have to eradicate inequality. And I think that's actually a little bit sad. It didn't feel like it was that long ago that in the land of the free, wealth and privilege and high income and so forth, those are things to aspire to. Those are things that people wanted. And it was a place where if you had a little bit of luck and you're willing to work hard and make some sacrifices and take some risks, take some chances, that you too could achieve that as well. You could achieve wealth. You could achieve, higher levels of income and so forth. And people actually, held up, the folks that were successful, they would be held up and say, this person's been successful. I want to be successful like that too. You see a guy, driving a Ferrari or whatever, and I remember these sorts of things, even as a kid growing up in the 80s, and you see that and you think, yeah, I'm going to have something like that too someday. And now it's like, you see somebody who's successful and you're like, screw that guy. Who the hell does he think he is? And that's an interesting change because it didn't used to be like that. And what's the reason for that? It's not really about inequality, because so long as there's been human beings, we all have various talents and skills and experiences and so forth. And you know what? I'm never going to be able to run as fast as Usain Bolt. And I'm okay with that. And if you've read any of my more personal missives, I'm never going to be able to dunk like Michael Jordan. I suck at basketball, and I always have. And I could, if I really wanted to, I could really try and improve my skills and so forth. But I just don't really see that being my calling. And I'm okay with that. I'm perfectly fine with that. There's certain things that I can do really well, and certain things that I haven't been able to do well in my life, and I've developed skills that I never thought I had and so forth. And that's the really great thing about being human, is that we can learn. We can learn at a much more rapid and geometric rate than any other, living creature on this planet. And that's a tremendous gift. We have that ability as human beings. And whenever, human beings find themselves in a situation where they don't, have something, in many cases, that is, it is our ability to create, it is our ability to improvise, it is our ability to learn and develop new skills, or improve on existing skills. And that becomes a major differentiator to improve our situation in life, to put more food on the table, to generate higher income, to generate wealth. That is something that is distinctly human. When I'm at the farm and I watch, my chickens and so forth, I mean, those guys they're one day away from extinction. I mean, they have to constantly go out there and scratch around and, and find a meal. They don't have a concept of savings. They have no concept of savings. But we do. We can have the discipline to go out and work a little bit harder and actually put some money away and then take that money and invest it in something, invest in education, invest it in skill development and so forth. And that's something that can actually, every single one of us can improve our situation in that way. And that used to be the way that it was. There used to be very few barriers to upward mobility because everybody had the chance to rise up. Everybody had the chance to sacrifice and work hard. I mean, one of the best biographies, and I think one of the best success stories that I've read in my life, certainly over the last couple of years, was the autobiography of Charlie Chaplin. Really great. And of course, Chaplin himself wasn't even an American citizen. He was born in London, in the UK, and was just had a horrible childhood, extremely poor, impoverished. And he came to the United States in the early 1900s, which was at the time a land of opportunity. And he got involved in an industry that was essentially a nascent industry, this motion picture industry and making silent films and so forth, and found tremendous success because he was free to be able to do that. He was free to be able to work hard and find talents and experiment and so forth. And it's just not really the case anymore. And this is really the idea of inequality, is that, again, it's a reflection of the time we live in. I think people are concerned about inequality, not because inequality exists, but because the idea of upward mobility has essentially been eradicated. There's very few opportunities for people to be upwardly mobile. If you're born in the middle class, you're much more likely to stay in the middle class than ever before in U.S. history. If you're born poor, you're more than likely going to stay poor. And that's been the case now more today than any other time in U.S. history. And more importantly, if you are born rich, you're going to stay rich. And this is banana republic stuff. And it's the idea of upward mobility is gone. It has been almost utterly vanquished because who needs it? How can you possibly do it? Because with this tremendous body of regulation, hundreds of pages a day of new regulation. If you don't believe me, go to the website federalregister.gov and be prepared to be knocked on your ass. Because you'll see, let me actually look at it. I will tell you in real time today, federalregister.gov. I just have to type F in my browser. I look at it so often. Today, 325 pages. Wednesday, January 21st, 325 pages in today's issue. Tomorrow, there's going to be another edition. You tell me, how the hell can somebody go out there and succeed when they have to keep up with 325 pages of regulation today? Today. How in the world is somebody supposed to be able to make it? How is somebody supposed to be able to start a business and achieve any level of success whatsoever? I just don't see how it's possible. This is what has utterly destroyed upward mobility in the land of the free. And this is why this whole sense against inequality really exists. Equality is a bullshit ideal. There is no two human beings that are equal, and we should embrace that. We're all unique and special snowflakes. But it's true. Nobody is equal. Nobody's ever going to be equal. I mean, in all things, we're different. And that's great. The whole idea is really, do we have the opportunity to go beyond, to be the best that we can possibly be, to achieve the best and highest of what we are and what we can possibly do? And the answer to that question now is no. And as Exhibit A, I point to 325 pages of new regulation in the land of the free today. Today. And that in and of itself is a failed premise. That is the ultimate in central power, central authority gone wrong. It's wrong. And inside of each of us, we feel that there's something wrong with that system. I think in almost every human being, because that's why there's this massive backlash against inequality. And that's a reflection of the time that we live in today. And I think it's sad because it didn't used to be that way. It used to be, hey, I want to be like that. Hey, I want to be successful too, and I'm going to get there. And now it's like just this sort of, everybody just sort of resigned to like, well, this is my lot in life and this is how I'm going to be. And there's no getting out of it. And that's sad. I'm here to tell you that it's actually still possible to pull yourself out of that. It's still possible. Upward mobility is entirely possible. You just have to think differently. You just have to do differently. It's not possible in the old way, but there's plenty of new ways to do it. The rule book's really being rewritten. It's a brand new game. It's about to be reset. But the interesting thing about this is that one of the big reasons why this inequality exists, of course, people point to the income and the wealth gap and so forth, but why does that really even exist to begin with? It's because there's been so much central authority. This central authority, this power that's been centralized and really abused, that has gone on and created all these regulations and so forth. And of course, one of the biggest culprits is, of this inequality has been the centralization of the power behind the currency. And this is kind of what we talked about in medieval France and England and so forth. Going back hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, they had their money supply was centralized. Today, our money supply is centralized. We centralize the creation and the distribution of our money. And that has created tremendous inequality because while on one hand, there's retail price inflation, on the other hand, there's also asset price inflation. So who benefits? Well, if you own a lot of assets, i.e. you're already incredibly wealthy, then you benefit from asset price inflation. If you don't own a lot of assets, then you don't benefit from that, and you get stuck with the retail price inflation. You get stuck paying more money for your homeowner's dues and for your medical insurance and for your college tuition and for all these things. You get stuck paying more money for all that stuff. And you don't really get the benefit. Hey, great, the stock market went up 30%. Well, if your entire portfolio is, $10,000, that extra, $3,000 that you might make in a couple of years on the stock market, it's not really going to be meaningful cash. It's not going to put your kid through college. $3,000 is not going to put your kid through college. So it's not really meaningful for you. What's more meaningful is the rise in prices out there. And that's been a massive failure. And what it's done is created a huge transfer of wealth from, people that are poor and in the middle class, to people that own a lot of assets. And that's been a direct result of this centralization and the power over the money supply. So what they've done is they've centralized the power to create and distribute money, and that's created this huge, income and wealth gap. And how do they want to solve the problem? They want to solve the problem by centralizing now the redistribution of money. And so what do? They cause a problem through centralization. They fix the problem that they themselves have created by redistributing it. And so now they want to go and they say, oh, we're going to, raise this tax here. We're going to, 28% capital gains. Bear in mind, capital gains tax was 15%. What was that? A year just in 2013? 15%. Now 28%. It's going to go to 28%. I mean, that's pretty extraordinary. And you could look at that in a lot of different ways. You could say, hey, they just handed people, these huge gains on the stock market, so now they're taking a little bit back. I mean, you could rationalize it in a million different ways. To me, it's not even about taxes going up, taxes going down, who takes from who and so forth. The whole point is really this failed premise of centralization. They create a problem because they've centralized all this power. And then they try and solve the problem by, continuing to abuse more of this centralized power. And when you step back and look at it, you think, God, this is utterly ridiculous. It's completely ridiculous. No matter how well-intentioned, again, I'm sure they're very nice people, but no matter how well-intentioned, it's just a failed premise because all they end up doing is creating more problems. So now they want to centralize a solution to the problem that they created by centralization. Of course, what are they going to do? They're going to create more problems that they're going to have to come up with more solutions for. And it's just never-ending saga of more power, more laws, more everything. And of course, the more that they do, the worse off everybody else is. And if you have any doubts about that, just think back to, if you're old enough, think back to your child. I think back to my old childhood. My own childhood, I'm a child of the early 80s. My father was able to go out and on a single salary, put food on the table for his family, pay the mortgage, occasionally, once a year, every other year, take the family on vacation. We never missed a meal. Everything was fine. And on one income, he was able to do that. My father's father was a school teacher, and on one income, he was able to go out and support the family. My father grew up in the 1950s, and on one income, he was able to do that as well. And that's the way it used to be. And today, yeah, of course, lots of people in the workforce, and, it's not about, women in the workforce. And that's great. Like, people want to work, that's fine. But the point is that in this day and age, a lot of people have to get out there in the workforce. Not in this day and age, in a family, growing up trying to make it, both parents need to get out there and work just to be able to make ends meet, because everything is so expensive. It's so much more, and it's not about, we had 1.7% inflation this year, or we think deflation's coming, forget about it. I mean, I'm tired of having the argument and saying, like, well, let's look at what the real numbers are, and just forget it. Just think back to what it used to be. It didn't used to be that you had to have both parents work. It used to be one parent could work and one parent could do whatever, raise the children, whatever. And that's the way it used to be. And now you can't do that. Fewer and fewer and fewer people are able to do that. And the president of the United States himself can acknowledge that, because there are tens of millions of dual income households in the land of the free. And so what's his solution? His solution is, well, let's take some money from rich people and give it back to these tens of millions of dual income households. And so he's proposing this, $500 tax credit. Okay. So that's great. Again, very nice idea. Thank you very much. Nice intention, well-meaning. Okay. We appreciate that. But how about, what is your $500 really going to do? What's it really going to do? Is it going to put somebody through college? Is it going to help them actually establish some meaningful savings reserve fund in case something bad happens? What is that $500 is nothing. It's nothing anymore. It hardly buys anything. I mean, you can blow through that in one night out with a couple of friends. I mean, it's not significant money. Instead, how about you stop messing with the currency? How about you stop conjuring hundreds of billions of dollars out of thin air? How about you stop making stuff more expensive? Because that's really, he's talking about tax and, we got to help the middle class and so forth. Well, how about you eliminate the greatest tax of all? And that's, of course, the tax of inflation. And I don't care, again, what the statistics say, and we don't even talk about the numbers anymore. Just look anecdotally and think to yourself how much things have changed, lifestyles and so forth, the things that we have to do just to be able to sort of maintain that basic standard of living, and how much more expensive it is now than it used to be. It's a lot more expensive. And we can see this all anecdotally, what it takes to, for a couple to get married, have children, take them all the way through, and, put money away for college and retirement and medical expenses and all these things. It's a lot more expensive than it used to be. And that's why we have to have, multiple income households and so forth. So how about instead you eliminate the tax on the middle class? You eliminate this inflation tax. You stop messing with the currency. But of course, that's not, really brought up. What's brought up is this, all these sort of jabs at the rich, and the super rich and, all these things. And these proposals say, oh, well, here, we'll give you, some $500. I mean, it just reminds me of the bread and circuses approach. You give people some, a few crumbs, and, we're all supposed to be okay. And, I guess to me, what was the larger issue is that they're talking about, in the entire, this is an hour-long speech, and then, they have the response from the Republicans, and, this woman talking about, the Republican agenda, and we're back to work, and all this stuff. Okay, that's great. Do you realize that there were absolutely zero mentions of the national debt, which just happens to be $18 trillion, far larger than the entire United States GDP. And as we wrote in Notes from the Field yesterday, the president, of course, congratulated himself. He mentioned all these things, unemployment is lower than it used to be. Yes, of course. I wrote that he would say that. Of course, failing to mention that, a substantial portion of these jobs created were in fast food and bartending and so forth. But okay, fine. I'm surprised he actually mentioned, the stock market is much higher than it was. Yeah, okay, great. Hooray for centrally planned, monetary policy. No mention about the debt. And it's kind of an interesting thing because, it's like they'll say, oh, I've cut the budget deficit. Well, if that's true, then why do they add $1 trillion to the debt last year? $1 trillion has been added to the debt. In fact, $1 trillion gets added roughly every single year. $1 trillion. Now, the economy doesn't grow that fast. I mean, the economy's at, let's say $16 trillion, 3%, 4%. I mean, 4% GDP growth. I mean, that would be, it's crazy. I mean, 5%. I mean, we're talking internet.com boom, levels. But even still, is that 16, 30, 48, 64? We're talking, $650 billion a year in economic growth, $1 trillion a year plus in debt growth. The debt growth outweighs the economic growth. Nothing about that in the speech. Nothing about that. And why? Because unborn children don't vote. And that's really what it is. It's quite easy to go and, raise taxes on the rich because there's not a whole lot of them. And so, in terms of the political constituency, it's pretty limited. But the most limited political constituency out there are unborn children. Unborn children don't vote. A child born, a couple of years from now isn't going to be able to vote for decades. Certainly won't have to worry about Obama. Cousin Barry, he's going to be long out of office by the time any of these, children that are born, today, tomorrow, or by the time his administration expires, by the time they come of voting age, he's long gone. So he can screw unborn children all he wants because they don't vote. And, nobody's ever going to come back to it. It's not like, people in my generation say, to hell with Gerald Ford. That guy really hosed me. I mean, nobody ever really thinks back to, looking at the guys before that racked up all these, all this spending. And again, it's not Cousin Barry's fault. He's doing what he feels like is the best thing. I'm sure he feels, again, giving out free education and all this stuff, it's great stuff. And, and everybody feels that what they do is great. But the problem is, again, it all comes down to this failed premise that we can centralize all this power, give it to a handful of people and expect to have major success because it just doesn't work out that way ever. Ask Martin Luther. Ask the French and the English. In the 13th century, it just doesn't work. And what you end up with, it became completely obvious to me. I mean, looking at this, the president of the United States, Cousin Barry has no earthly idea how central banking works because, again, he's trying to fix a problem that, was caused by centralized authority, by, stepping up his own centralized authority, and really has absolutely no understanding. I mean, talking about, he thinks that he can improve this idea of inequality by giving people $500. I mean, it just seems completely out of touch. But the biggest point really, aside from this, like, hey, let's cut the inflation tax, is really no mention of the national debt. It's not like, hey, let's increase taxes so we can pay down the debt. No mention of that whatsoever. It's completely in la land here, have no earthly idea. And it's funny because somebody sent me this YouTube video, and I can't even bring myself to mention this because it was just so intellectually offensive. It was some teenager, I don't know what. It's like some kind of school project. I don't even know what. And, some young kid, and he's basically saying, the whole YouTube video is, he's saying, if the United States is $18 trillion in debt, can we, how could we possibly call ourselves a wealthy nation? And then he, and I look at this, and at first I think, this kid's got it. Like, this is pretty amazing. There's this young kid who understands. Then he proceeds to go on and explain why the debt doesn't matter. And of course, it's that old song, because we owe it to ourselves, which of course is the biggest bunch of bullshit, because I'm sorry, I fail to find solace in any encouragement in the fact that, somehow the United States government owes this huge chunk of debt to the American people, as if it's okay that we default on Social Security recipients. That's that's perfectly fine, or that somehow because we owe it to ourselves, does that mean we don't have to pay it back so that it doesn't count? If you loan money to your brother-in-law, is it all right if he doesn't pay you back? I mean, I'm sorry, but I just don't really get that. I don't get that it's okay that, we can default on ourselves, that it's only bad if we default on the Chinese. I mean, I just don't understand this. And yet this has become this pervasive thinking that people honestly believe it's okay. It's okay that the United States of America has a debt level that exceeds 100% of its GDP, and that the growth of the debt far exceeds the growth of the economy. And so what does that mean? Quite simply, the problem continues to get worse, and that they're doing everything they can desperately to hold down interest rates. And yet now, the Fed's talking about, eventually we're going to raise interest rates. Well, what does that do when you raise interest rates? It means that the government's going to have to pay more in interest. They're already paying $500 billion in interest every year. $500 billion. I mean, this is an absurd amount of not only the tax revenue, but of the economy itself. I mean, a huge chunk of the economy is just going to pay interest on the national debt. How can you achieve meaningful economic growth when a chunk of the economy itself, has to go? How can you achieve, 3, 4, 5% growth when you have to spend, 2, 3, 4, 5% just to pay interest on the debt? It just doesn't make any sense. And yet people just believe that it doesn't matter, and this is really what we're always talking about here, is that these things have consequences. Oh, I almost forgot. Then there's, I would be remiss if I didn't bring this up. I promise I'll do a whole notes article to explain this. But what we continue to see now is this long, slow road to, I wouldn't even call it IRA nationalization. But look, it was a year ago. I've been saying this for years, right? The U.S. government is going to have to come up with some way to finance all of this debt. And where are they going to go? Because we can see, the Chinese are out there actively trying to promote their own brand new financial system, and the renminbi becoming the world's reserve currency, which means that eventually people are going to stop, carrying as many dollars as they do. And we've already seen some evidence of that already. So where are they going to get the money from? Well, there's trillions of dollars sitting in individual retirement accounts. Seems like a pretty great pool. So I've been saying this for years, that there's going to come a time where they're going to, say, well, for the sake, for the sake of everyone's retirement account, we think that people should invest their retirement savings in the safety and security of U.S. treasuries. And they'll just go and mandate that, a portion of all of these managed IRA accounts, they'll call up the big financial institutions that manage a couple $1 trillion in retirement accounts, and they'll say, hey, you need to park 10%, 20%, 50% of these funds in treasuries. And they'll say, okay, because they have to. And then last year, in his State of the Union address, the president launched this Myra program, which of course makes it easier than ever for Americans to loan their money directly to the federal government, to loan their retirement savings directly to the federal government. The Myra is this way to set up an individual retirement account at basically no cost, no expense, and be able to put money directly at work in the safety and security of U.S. treasuries. I mean, he almost said this practically verbatim, the stuff that I've been talking about for years. It was really scary. Now what we find is the new tax proposal is that he wants basically every small business with more than, 10 employees to have to automatically enroll all of their employees, including part-timers, in an individual retirement account program, even if the employee doesn't want it. If an employee says, no, I don't want to have an IRA, the employer still has to enroll him in the IRA. It's amazing. And then the employee, if they don't want it, they have to go through the effort to actually disenroll. It's crazy when you think about it. And of course, this is expensive. This is administratively costly. It's time consuming. Who the hell wants to do that? Well, sure enough, there's a very easy option for small businesses that don't want to have to go through the expense, or medium-sized businesses that don't want to have to go through the expense and the time and the hassle and the cost, the administrative BS to get that done. What do? They just enroll everybody in what? The government option, the Myra program. Hey, everybody, all my employees, you're now enrolled in the Myra program. So congratulations, we're going to start moving money directly from your paycheck to the federal government. And you have to do this because Cousin Barry said we had to. And that's the proposal. And I look at that and said, yet another huge step down the long and winding road towards IRA nationalization, towards diverting a huge portion of people's IRAs to U.S. treasuries because they need it. And now they made it very easy with the Myra program. And now they're mandating that everybody has to have an IRA. So what's next? Well, we'll talk about that in another notes article. But I want to go ahead and tie this up because we've talked about a lot of things. Ultimately, remember, this comes down to the failure of central planning. This comes down to the failed premise of taking a handful of people, elected or unelected, and giving them all the power and influence and charge and resources and so forth to make all these decisions on behalf of everybody else. This has consequences. And we can see it as plain as day. It's had 18 trillion consequences. And we pretend like, a lot of people pretend like, not you and me, pretend like there's no consequences, that this is a consequence-free environment, that these 18 trillion reasons to have some concern are really trivial because we've managed to convince ourselves that, we owe it to ourselves, so it's okay. This system has consequences. And history shows, again, that what countries do when they get into this kind of situation, they turn the screws, they plunder, they steal, they come up with every possible option, they inflate, they confiscate, they do everything they can to get out of the situation. This cannot last forever. Do you really think that 18 trillion, 19 trillion, 20 trillion, 100%, 110%, 120% of GDP, 150%, there's got to be a certain level where we finally say, okay, not even us, the rest of the world says, you know what, I'm done. I'm finished with dollars, and it's already happening. It's already happening. The Chinese are out there pushing for a new system. The Russians are out there pushing for a new system. The French have said it's absurd why we still use the dollar as the primary reserve currency. It doesn't make any sense. It's happening. This isn't any crazy conspiracy theory. This isn't any tinfoil hat stuff. These are just statements of fact. It's happening. There are consequences, and those consequences are already unfolding. And of course, it happens slowly at first, then all at once. Gradually, then suddenly. That's the right quote. I always flub that one. Gradually, then suddenly. That's what Hemingway told us. And so this is the stuff that we can expect. And this is what I always want to encourage people to do, is that when you can look, if you're in the United States, and this isn't directed towards Americans. I don't care where you are. If you're from Britain, if you're from Belgium, it doesn't matter. Look at your own situation. I mean, there's a lot of bankrupt governments out there. There's a ton of bankrupt governments out there. That has consequences. It has consequences. We just happen to be talking about the U.S. because Cousin Barry gave his big speech yesterday. Although I think we could probably talk a lot about David Cameron, a lot of the things, weird stuff that's been coming out of his mouth lately. In this case, look, I mean, Cousin Barry's telling us that it's all okay, that we've turned the corner and so on and so forth. I mean, I think that's really going to be his mission accomplished moment. I mean, there's a ton of risk out there in the marketplace, and he's saying, what do you say? The shadow of, whatever he said, something is all, we turn the corner and it's long past and everything's fine. I think that's going to be his mission accomplished moment. Time will tell. But at the end of the day, whether it happens today, tomorrow, 10 years from now, or even miraculously not at all, I think any rational person has to conclude that there's 18 trillion plus risks out there. And those are substantial risks, because when it happens, when the rest of the world says enough is enough, when there's another shutdown, when there's, when people finally realize that the central bank of the United States is insolvent, let alone the government of the United States is insolvent, and people start, shipping their dollars back home, and they're looking for ways that they can, raise more money and all these sorts of things. There are consequences to that. We don't have to look very far in history to see that. We can see what happened in Cyprus, just in 2013. We can see the bank freeze. We can see all these things. We can see IRA nationalization. We've seen it in Poland and Argentina, all kinds of places. They've done it in the United States. In the United States, the last time the government shut down, what did? They seized federal pension funds because they were broke and they had to. This is what bankrupt governments do. And again, the question that any rational person has to ask himself or herself is to say, do I really think that there is zero consequences to this kind of environment? Of course, it's absurd. It's absurd to think that there's zero consequences. And the fact is that the world is a big place. And there are a lot of options and a lot of opportunities. These problems are as old as human history itself. Every time that we've gone out to try and centralize power in the hands of a tiny few, there have always been problems. But the solutions to those problems are as old as the problems themselves. And when you can see that your government is bankrupt, when you can see that the financial system, that the currency itself is the fundamentals are to the point where the central bank is insolvent, that the government backing the central bank is insolvent, that the entire world is pushing towards another brand new financial system, that they have abused every benefit and privilege they've been given with the existing financial system, that has consequences. We can also see the erosion of civil liberties in front of us and see, just the absurd amount of things. I get these people send me this stuff all the time. It's crazy. The level of, do you feel more free or less free than you did 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago? Where is that trend going? And I think any rational person has to look at it and feel like they feel less free. Is freedom important to you at all? Then take it back. Take it back. Take it back from the central power and give it back to the individual power. You have the ability to do that. All the tools, all the resources exist for you to do that. And they're as old as the problems themselves. When everything in your home country suggests that your home government is bankrupt, that the financial system is due for a reset. And again, we talk about this all the time. History shows that the dominant superpower is always changing. The financial system is always changing and so forth. It's happening. It's happening now. We can see it. It's happening slowly and slowly and slowly. And then all of a sudden, we'll see some massive changes, in many cases, even overnight. We're not at that point yet, but why wait? Nobody's going to send you an engraved invitation and say, hey, Bob, just want to let you know the dollar is going to collapse 3 weeks from now. So, get your stuff together. Nobody's going to tell you that. Nobody's going to tell you, hey, we're planning on, nationalizing IRAs. We're planning on defaulting on the debt. We're planning on going to war with the Chinese. Nobody's going to tell you anything like that in advance. You're not going to get a notice. There's no tweet from the White House going out. All we have to do is look at the data. We look at what's going on. We look at the trend, and it makes sense to start taking these kinds of steps now. That's ultimately why we're here. That's ultimately what we do. That's the world that I want to show you. I fear that most people are asleep. I think most people are asleep. They go through life believing lies, and don't really have a sense of what the truth is. It's a bit like the Matrix in a way. They're sort of plugged into the grid and they don't feel what the real truth is, and they won't know it until it's too late. I know you're listening to this because you do feel it, you do understand, you do get it, and you've probably already taken steps to start to unplug. And I would commend you for that, because I think it's something that makes sense no matter what. If what I'm talking about actually comes to pass, it could be some of the smartest moves that you've ever made. And of course, if nothing happens, then you're not going to be worse off. You're not going to be worse off because you've moved money to a bank in a place that is 40 times better capitalized than where you currently bank, or pays 50 times greater interest than where you currently bank. It's hard to imagine you're going to be worse off for that. And that's really what it's all about. It's a nice thing about the things that we talk about is that you're not really taking on it. You're mitigating risk and you're minimizing costs, and there's very little, if any, downside whatsoever. And that's kind of the us versus them, issue. I think what you find is all these guys that are still plugged into the Matrix, they're going to do what they're told to do. They're going to be dutiful little citizens. They're going to open up their Myra account. They're going to loan their money to the federal government. They're going to do all these things, that Cousin Barry tells them to do, that their government tells them to do. They're going to be just fine because the government says, hey, everything's cool and we've turned the corner and it's all fine. They're going to invest in the stock market at their all-time high, and they're going to do absolutely nothing. And what you have the ability to do is you have the ability to move your money to another place. Again, overseas at a bank that's 40 times more capitalized and pays 50 times better interest. And you have the ability to actually invest in things overseas, where you can invest in thriving, productive companies that are making a lot of money and happen to be trading for less than the value of cash that they have in the bank. And you can make a lot of money in different international investments, or you can get into agricultural property, or you can do these things and you can legitimately minimize your taxes. You can reduce the amount of money that you're spending out of your own hard-earned savings, your own hard-earned labor that's going towards financing wars and bombs and drones and spying. And you can legally minimize that by setting up different offshore structures and moving your affairs into places that are all completely legitimate. That's what you can do. The other guy's not going to do that. Your neighbor's going to say, oh, you know what? I got my Myra and the government's giving me an interest rate that's less than the rate of inflation, but it's all good because they told me that everything's fine. And you've got interests around the world. You've got accounts around the world. You've got gold tucked away in a safety deposit box in Switzerland or Austria in a highly secure private facility. It makes you feel like you're in the Jason Bourne movie when you walk in, and it's completely secretive and totally legal. You don't even have to report it by the government's own rules. You don't even have to report it. And that's what you have the ability to do. Now, none of these things, it's not going to help you lose weight or restore your hairline or anything like that. But what it can do is really give you the ultimate peace of mind. It can give you this tremendous benefit knowing that everything that you've worked for your entire life to build for yourself, for your family, for your loved ones, isn't going to go away to some bankrupt government when the time comes and they need to confiscate your funds. This stuff has consequences. Do you really think that $18 trillion in debt has no consequences? And are you really going to be any worse off because you happen to move some money to a safe, thriving, financially responsible, well-capitalized, highly liquid bank in a jurisdiction that's never had a banking failure ever? Are you really going to be worse off for that? And that's really what it comes down to. That's the question that I have for you. I'd really encourage you to take some of these steps. Of course, this is what we constantly try and put out. We try and provide this more educational information and notes from the field. That's why this free email service really exists, to provide a lot of educational information for folks. Our premium services exist: Sovereign Man Confidential, Liberty Alert, Price Value International, Sovereign Man Private Investor, and so forth. These exist to provide the actionable information, the intelligence you need. Most of these things we can't really put out there to 200,000 people, blasting across the internet. That's why we have a higher level premium services for this. It's not for everybody, but I'm here to tell you that I believe there are tremendous value, and I definitely encourage you to give them a try. I want to make it worth your while. And for the next couple of days, we are having a promotion on Sovereign Man Confidential, giving away even more value than usual. So I want you to definitely check that out. Definitely give it some thought to join us, to join our premium ranks. I absolutely guarantee it. I don't just say that as an empty promise. I absolutely do guarantee that you'll get multiples of your money's worth. Again, I would encourage you, this is not for everybody. And it's important to keep that in mind. But I do look forward to seeing more of us on the other side and folks taking advantage of this actionable information, the solutions that we have, whether you get that information from Notes in the Field or SMC or anywhere else. These are important steps to take, and I really encourage people to do that. And I'm going to go ahead and sign off from here. So I want to appreciate everybody's time and attention. Thanks for listening. It's been a while since we've done a podcast. We'll start doing these with much more regularity now. So thanks everybody for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.